What if you could step back in time and talk with some of Kansas City's most historic figures? The innovators and achievers who left their mark on our town, on our nation. What would you ask if you could meet the past? This week, Crosby gets animated with Walt Disney, the man from Marceline, Missouri, who created feature-length cartoons, live-action family films, and loads of fun-filled memories at the House of Mickey.
Now, Mickey, I know you've had an interesting life. You're born in a hole in the wall. You put out to sea in a steamboat. You were chased by Fritz the cat. And finally, your life came to the end. You were given a kingdom on both coasts. But even though your life story is pretty interesting, that's not why we're here. We're here because the library itself, being a magical kingdom, we can bring back your creator, the man from Marceline, Missouri, who grew up in Kansas City and gave the world a magical kingdom. Ladies and gentlemen, Walt Disney. Now, Walt, there are a lot of stories about the creation of this incredible mouse, Mickey Mouse, and a lot of different stories, but my favorite story is the story about Mortimer Mouse. Can you tell us how Mickey Mouse was created, and maybe if he was created in Kansas City?
Mortimer was a friend of mine in the old McConaughey building at 30th and Forest, 31st and Forest. He was a mouse that I discovered out in a vacant lot nearby, and a very friendly little mouse, but I kept him in a coffee can when I wasn't there, and then fed him a little bit from the cafe down below. Unfortunately, when I left Kansas City, I had to let him go. But I always referred to him as Mortimer. Now, let's fast forward to 1929, and the year in which I lost control of Oswald the rabbit. On the way back from New York, I had to come up with a plan, because I had told Roy that everything was all right, and it wasn't. So I thought and decided we could still do Oswald. We just needed to change his ears. So we gave him round ears, in my mind, instead of the pointed ears. And I threw this out to Lillian, and I said, "Here's my new friend, Mortimer Mouse." Well, she liked the mouse, hated the name. She said, "That looks like a Mickey." And I thought, that's not a bad idea. So Mickey was born.
An Irish mouse. Now, it seems to me there is a little bit of a theme here. Rabbits and mice, and later there were ducks. Does any of this have to do with Marceline, Missouri, and the farm that you grew up on there in north central Missouri?
Well, we certainly had field mice in Marceline, I can tell you. Marceline really is my idea of a hometown.
I've heard that you met Buffalo Bill?
Coming down the street, gonna have his Wild West show. You see, Marceline was a division point on the Santa Fe. So we got a lot of the big shows coming through. And you know what?
Tell me.
He stopped his carriage right in front and asked me to ride with him to the show.
Boy, that must have been impressive how old were you, 7, 8 years old?
I was no more than that, and you better believe it was impressive. Otherwise, Marceline wasn't a big town.
And you went back often, I think, in your career, so it must have meant something to you. So you grew up on the farm, but then your father sold the farm and moved to Kansas City, and he bought a paper route from the Kansas City Star and put you to work. Do you remember that?
How can I forget? 4:30 every morning. 7 days a week. We had to walk the papers because we took them up to the porch, and if it was windy, they had to be put under a rock on the front porch. And if they had a storm door, they had to go inside the storm door. I'm sure the paper boys do that today.
You went to the Benton School, which still stands over in the old neighborhood. And in the Benton School, you had a great teacher named Daisy Beck. And one day, there's another story about the invention of Mickey Mouse that has to do with a mouse that you brought to Mrs. Beck.
Well, this was a little bit of a trick we played on her. We brought a mouse into the classroom and brought it forth for her excitement as well as the girls' excitement at an appropriate time in the afternoon.
I heard when you brought the mouse in on a leash, she slapped you.
Well, she had a right to.
Yeah.
But she didn't take me to Mr. Cottingham.
The principal of Benton
Right.
School, who gave you an award, a $7 award, was it?
Yes, indeed. I had done some drawing, and he was impressed with it, and I got my first payment for my art from Mr. Cottingham.
Starting on a great career at Benton School. So clearly this was in your blood. You were an artist, you loved Charlie Chaplin and the movies, and your father, who was a very hard-working religious disciplinarian, was not really happy about it, but he let you go to the Kansas City Art Institute for some classes.
That was an amazing thing. On Saturday mornings, after I delivered the papers, I got to go to some classes at the Art Institute. They were giving them, of course, for anybody that would come and pay a little tuition for the privilege.
And World War I comes along, changed a lot of people's lives, and it changed your life because you, imitating your brother Roy, who went off to war, you signed up for the Red Cross and got over to Europe. But when you came back, you asserted your independence, maybe with a little help from your brother Roy, and went to work for the Kansas City Film Ad Company. Kansas City Slide Company was also known. A man named A.V. Cogger. You decided to be an artist.
Well, Roy introduced me to A.V. Cogger and the possibility of doing some drawing for him at the Film Ad Company. They made slides for the movie houses.
And so you got to start with that there, and you met a guy named Ub Iwerks, a pretty interesting guy, on the theory that not just because this was the bank building where your brother Roy worked, but because this is now the public library, I have this basic theory that everything starts at the Kansas City, Missouri Public Library, and you checked out a book. In fact, you checked this book that I hold in my hand here, Animated Cartoons by E.G. Lutz, How They Are Made, Their Origin and Development. You checked this book out of the library, and it changed your life.
Well, we didn't check it back in real quickly, I can tell you. But this was our Bible.
Now that you're successful, can we get that fine paid?
The book by Lutz, though, was very important because we didn't know anything about cartooning. We knew a little bit about drawing. Ub was a tremendous artist as far as being able to draw cartoons. You know, on one occasion, he put out 700 different drawings in one day. This was when we were working up Mickey, as a matter of fact. I've never seen anybody be able to do that much.
And then you started Laugh-O-Gram Studios. This is really the first great venture of Walt Disney at 31st and Forest that you talked about where Mickey Mouse was invented. And you started to make cartoons, and you did something almost unique at that time in Alice's Wonderland, a film called Alice's Wonderland with a little girl named Virginia Davis.
There were people who had done situations where they stuck cartoons into a real world. What we did was we stuck a real little girl into a cartoon world. And so she would be running along, or she would jump over a fence, or she would hide behind a tree, and all of that would be in a cartoon, but she would be doing it in live action. So we were combining the two mediums in a silent film, of course, because that's all we had at the time.
But it wasn't very successful ultimately. You lived in your studio, and
yeah, but the reality was that there was no way to make a living doing this kind of work in this particular place. There just weren't enough theaters, wasn't enough demand. And
the film capital of the world was Hollywood, California, so you decided to strike out for Hollywood.
Roy was in California, which is really the reason I went out there. He had been ill with tuberculosis and in fact was in a sanitarium out there at that time. And I found a distributor, not in California as it turned out, but in New York.
Margaret Winkler.
Margaret Winkler, one of the very few women in the film distribution business. Unfortunately, she got married.
To Charlie Mintz.
Charlie Mintz. And Charlie Mintz was a different sort of fellow than Margaret Winkler.
But you, in the meantime, you'd invented Oswald the rabbit.
Well, what happened is actually Charlie, once they got married, decided that Alice needed to be retired, and so Ub had come up with Oswald.
And he was a great character. I've seen some of those, and he takes off his body parts and uses them as tools to change the world.
Ub was very creative. And of course, what Mintz did is he actually sold the character to Universal Pictures, and it was a distribution contract with them. What I didn't know is that between Universal and Mintz, they actually owned Oswald. I didn't. But I didn't know that.
So you had to invent a new character, and you've told us a little bit about the invention of Mickey Mouse, but tell us about Plane Crazy and Steamboat Willie and what happened to your world and the world.
This was 1928, and we had to come up with something very quickly to capitalize on this idea of Mickey Mouse. The most popular man in the country was Lindbergh, so we did Plane Crazy, which was Mickey learning to fly and taking Minnie along with him. But it was a silent film, and something had happened in that time frame, and we had to have something that would make our cartoons different.
And that something was
sound.
The jazz singer.
Absolutely.
By the way, it is said about Mickey Mouse that you didn't know how to draw him, that it was Ub Iwerks who could draw him. And people would come up to you on the street and want you to draw Mickey Mouse, and you couldn't really do it.
I didn't spend a great deal of time practicing my artistic skill at that point, and Ub certainly did do a great deal of it. But there was another way, ultimately, that I did have a fair amount to do with Mickey, and that's I became his voice.
You were the voice, which, after all, was the important thing. They called Steamboat Willie the jazz singer of animation. But sound became very important, obviously, and you made these. You then segued from Mickey into making the silly symphonies. There was something called the skeleton dance that you made, which some people thought was gruesome and awful, but had an incredible audience reaction.
Well, what we did is we animated a sequence to one of Mailer's best-known melodies, and had these dancing skeletons do all kinds of weird and wonderful things. And it was something like people had never seen before. The idea of having a classical piece of music in which you had kind of the macabre brought out and placed before them, and they loved it.
I understand that Louis B. Mayer, the head of MGM, looked at it and he said it was ridiculous. But then you took it to Columbia Pictures, to a young man named Frank Capra, who was pretty successful at the time, and he loved it.
Well, indeed, Columbia Pictures, for a short time, became very important to us because they got us out from under Pat Powers. Pat Powers had owned the sound system that we recorded with, and he was wanting more and more money for that privilege, as well as trying to manage the distribution again. But we'd made sure we owned Mickey, and we were able to get Mickey and the Silly Symphonies distributed all over the country. And that led to things like the Mickey Mouse Club.
Well, that's incredible to me. The Mickey Mouse Club starts, and it's got all of a sudden millions of members across the country. Here you go from 12 people in a garage, you and Ub Iwerks and 10 other people creating Mickey and the Silly Symphonies. At this point, you're building your staff. You love the fraternity of making these movies. You're really going to town, but you're spending a lot of money. You're up to 200 people. You're spending a lot of money, and then you make a feature cartoon called The Three Little Pigs. We're talking about the middle of the Great Depression, and The Three Little Pigs is an incredible success. Tell us about that.
It was one of those things that just happens. It was a fairy tale. We had picked up parts of it out of the Brothers Grimm and a couple of other sources, and then we basically updated it just a little bit, and we put it to songs.
Who's afraid of the big bad wolf?
And people got excited about it. Of course, maybe it was that we released it about 5 weeks after Franklin Roosevelt became President of the United States, and he was saying the only thing you had to fear was fear itself.
Right,
So
right.
the timing was fairly good, as it turned out.
It was said that it was the anthem of the Depression. But you decided at that point that making cartoons, making these shorts, wasn't enough. And you'd seen a film in 1917 here in Kansas City in the Convention Center. Do you remember that film?
Starred Marguerite Clark. Absolutely.
And it was about
Snow White.
Snow White.
In the original story and in Marguerite Clark's version, there were 7 dwarfs. Period. No names, no personality, 7 dwarfs. I thought those dwarfs needed a personality.
And you had a lot of names for those dwarfs initially.
Oh, Blabby, Flabby, Gabby.
Scrappy, Cranky, Dirty, Awful, Blabby, Silly, Daffy, Johnny, Big O, Ego, Chesty, Jumpy, Baldy, Hickey, Gabby, Shorty, Nifty, Wheezy, Sniffy, Burpy, Lazy, Dizzy, Stuffy, Tubby, and of course, Grumpy, Happy, Doc, Bashful, and Dopey.
Fortunately, the last one stuck.
Right.
I called them my screwy dwarfs, and they were what made the film, I think.
Well, and your perfectionism made the film too, Walt. You invented whole new processes to get a sense of depth of field and to really engender a sense of incredible realism in these
That was our
animated
multiplane
figures.
camera. This is a 2-story camera that we could put the cells in, and we could actually then pull them out, and we could lower the camera into it so that you really got a sense of the depth of the picture that way. And it was a remarkable achievement. I hold the patent on that camera.
And so you made Snow White a huge success, an incredible success, and both critically and financially. But you managed to spend that money pretty quickly. You built a studio in
I've never
Burbank.
had trouble spending money.
Tell us about your evening alone initially at Chasen's Restaurant in the 1930s when a famous conductor, Leopold Stokowski, was there.
Well, you had to know Stokowski. He was called the Mad Pole. His hair would be up about like this, and so you would see him across any room. We visited a bit, and lo and behold, after we'd had a conversation and we began to acquire rights to music, before we'd ever done a foot of animation, we figured out that we'd spent $400,000 just getting the rights to this music.
Well,
The single thing that got it going, though, was this particular idea right here, and that was The Sorcerer's Apprentice. But then we added to that with all this other music and all these other styles of animation.
The Sorcerer's Apprentice, of course, is about young Mickey who discovers the secret words and says them, and things get out of control. In a way, of course, that's the story of Disney, the Disney studio at that point. You were making Fantasia. It took years and a huge amount of money. And you were also making Pinocchio and Bambi at the same time. And these are movies that we now think of as classics, but they weren't financial successes.
I thought every one of these was going to be a wonderful film. You know, with Fantasia, one of the things we did in the roadshow engagements in the big theaters is we installed a new sound system. We called it Fantasound. It sounded like the sound was coming at you from every direction. And we actually recorded different instruments and different sections of the orchestra on different tracks. So it was quite an experiment. None of those wound up making any money, but there was one that did. There was another movie that saved our bacon.
Dumbo.
Dumbo.
Dumbo, my personal favorite. I have dreams about Dumbo.
Oh, do you now?
Well, you know, but your real interest begins to change. You're beginning to create what's been called a Lilliputian version of Marceline, Missouri. And was this the origins of Disneyland?
Well, what I wanted to do was to create a place where everything was perfect. And my idea was to create it in miniatures. We were going to put it in the back of a semi-truck and cart it around the country and have people take a look at it. None of that worked. But the idea of all of this seemed to percolate a bit, And yes.
And so you begin to have the idea of a park, an amusement park, the greatest ever made. And the idea gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And pretty soon Roy says, you got to separate this from the company, because the company, again, is getting into financial trouble. And about the same time that happens, and it looks like you're going completely off the rails, something new happens in America, a new technology, not your technology, but a technology you really understood and understood how to take advantage of. And we're talking about television.
Most of the movie producers were scared to death of television because they thought it was going to be their death. I thought we could use television to make our movies go better, and we could use our movies maybe to make television go better. But in the meantime, I needed some help. So I went to the most struggling television network there was. It was the ABC television network. Sometimes they called it the Almost Broadcasting Network. They were interested in an hour-long program that they could show on a Sunday night. And we agreed to do that on a couple of conditions. Number one, we would call it Disneyland, the program, because we were trying to build up interest in Disneyland, the park. And secondly, we had an idea for a 3-week sequence of shows that we were going to put on in the fall. This was in the fall of 1954. It was about a fellow from the frontier days of America who started out in Tennessee and wound up in Texas.
Davy Crockett.
King of the Wild Frontier.
You turn this into a feature film, which becomes one of the most popular feature films, as it became one of the most popular television shows in the history of the United States. And I remember I was a 4 or 5-year-old boy. 10 million coonskin caps were sold. Oh, Walt, thank you. Thank you. My childhood, it all comes back to me. It all comes back to me now. And so, you sell the 10 million coonskin caps, you dominate television with Disneyland, it becomes the wonderful world of Disney, etc. Opening day, 25,000 people show up at Disneyland. The first year, 1 million people show up. Half the tourists who come to Southern California go to Disneyland. An incredible success. But as you came to the end of your career, there were really two things at the end of your career that were important to you. The making of the film Mary Poppins and the creation of Epcot Center. Tell us a little bit about Mary Poppins. It's a little bit different movie from most of your movies, which are about growing up and maturation and encountering obstacles and overcoming them. And Mary Poppins is kind of the reverse. It's kind of a movie about laughing, isn't it?
Well, there's a wonderful scene in it with Ed Wynn, where they get to laughing and they float up to the top of the room. And then when they stop laughing, they come back down. But when you're laughing, you're floating, and it's a great experience. But I'll tell you, the part of Mary Poppins, the song that I love best, the Sherman Brothers did the writing and the music for Mary Poppins, and they won an Oscar for it as well. But the song that I love the best out of that is Feed the Birds. And of an afternoon when I'd go in and Hazel would have a Scotch mist on the sideboard there, and Richard Sherman would come in and I'd just tell him, play it. And he knew what I meant. He'd play Feed the Birds. And I'd have my little cry, and we'd go on through the day at that point. But no, it was wonderful. And of course, Julie Andrews was marvelous.
She got the Academy Award for Best Actress. And shortly after that, you get the Medal of Freedom from the President of the United States in pretty incredible company. T.S. Eliot, Willem de Kooning, Aaron Copland. You've reached the pinnacle of your career, but one last thing that you wanted to do was Epcot. And it kind of goes back to your Kansas City roots. There was a book very important to you, Garden Cities of Tomorrow by Ebenezer Howard, which was about the creation of the Garden Cities movement in England, which was like the City Beautiful movement in the Kansas City of your youth.
Epcot, which was the experimental prototype community of tomorrow, was to be a place for all the people who would work at the Magic Kingdom, for them to live, for them to enjoy to have as the ideal living place as an example for the entire country. And I was excited about that.
As you became ill, of course, the Epcot dream faded away a little bit. But in your last conversation with Hazel George, your friend Hazel, you said to her, "Fancy being remembered for the invention of a mouse." But all I have to say, Walt, is, what a mouse. Ladies and gentlemen, Walt Disney. Thank you.
Almost everybody has a Disney experience. They've got a Disney, they've seen a movie, they have a character they particularly like. All the little girls have got their princess, whatever. But the fact is that it's one of those almost universal experiences. We don't have that many of those in American life. So again, for me, the fun of it is seeing how that triggers those responses.
To learn more about Walt Disney, reading lists and more can be found at the Kansas City Public Library or at kclibrary.org.